Now, in the second reading, we'll begin to look more about methods, and I'm not going to say very much about that reading now. I've said a bit of an introduction to it already, but I want you to consider the following things. What is the difference between a method and methodology? Okay. What is the difference between an approach and a method? What is the difference between a procedure and a method? What is the difference between a procedure and a technique? To go back, we study methodology, but we have teaching methods. Are they the same? Methodology might seem to be more of a broader term than the method. The method seems more specific, so how do we distinguish between the two? What do they mean? What is the difference between an approach and a method? Perhaps this is getting closer to what we want to say. If you approach something, it's how you look at something. The method is what you actually do with your approach. So, if you are a humanist, you approach teaching from a humanist perspective. You think about the learner's feeling. So what method do you use to involve your humanistic approach into teaching? Okay? So you may be a humanist, but how do you teach? The method is how you teach. What is the difference between a procedure and a method? Now, a procedure obviously is somehow something in process, okay? So if you have a method, how do you put this method into play? What do you do in the classroom? And is there a difference between a procedure and a technique? Okay, so for example, you believe that doing group work in your class is a good idea. This is the best way for students to learn, for them to converse, exchange ideas, and be spontaneous and learn. So you have the procedure, group work. Well, great, do group work. But then how do you actually divide the students into groups? And how do you make it work? How many students in the group? Do they give them roles, for example? That would be a technique. The procedure is group work, but the technique would be the actual implementation of that procedure. Now, I've given a couple other perspectives here, and this is very similar to what I've just talked about. This is from Richards and Rogers. It's a very good book on approaches and methods in English language teaching. It's a very standard book, and it goes through most of the main methods for English language teaching and discusses each one along these parameters. And the way that Richards and Rogers distinguish a method is they say method is divided into approach, design, and procedure. The approach is theory of language and theory of language learning. Okay, it's how you look at things from the outside. Design is the general and specific objectives of that method. So that includes syllabus, the types of activities, the roles of learners, the roles of the teachers, and the roles of the instructional material. Okay, now I want you to think about the triangle for a second, because in that triangle we talked about these things. All of these things involved in that triangle. We talked about several modules before. Finally, the procedures. These are the actual techniques and practices and behaviors when the method is used. Now, Harmer, which is the article that you'll be reading today for this module, distinguishes between approach, method, procedure, and technique. So it's slightly different because he's put method under approach, okay? Unlike with Richards and Rogers, but it's the same idea. Since you'll be reading this in the reading, I won't explain more, but I think you get the basic idea. Technique being the most precise, the actual execution of what you want to do, whereas the approach being your philosophy, for example, which would eventually influence the method influences the procedure influences the technique. Another reading that I'll be sending to you is by Knight. This is similar to the Harmer reading, and there'll be a lot of overlap this time, I have to warn you. You'll be reading about the same things more than once, but that's okay. They don't say exactly the same thing, and you'll see a slightly different perspective on the same topics, the same methods. So don't just skip the section on community language learning because you've already read it in the other reading. Read everything, because Knight has a slightly different approach. It's a bit more down to earth, I think. He's looking at what is the desired outcome, okay, when you teach for a method. What is the desire? What do you want to achieve? This seems quite clear. You want students to learn. But learn for what reason? Should they speak? Should they write? What exactly do you want them to be able to do? This is the basis for examining a method, according to Knight. Now, also important is what model of language is it based on? Now, Perhaps you think, well, this seems confusing because language is language. But not really, because if you consider language a set of vocabulary and a set of structures, sentence patterns that you can put that vocabulary into, it's very, very basic, okay? And you need to teach that. But language is much more than that. Language is communication. So if the purpose is to get students to communicate, then you need to not just tailor those structures to that type of, to the communication, to the things they might need to do with the language, but also you need to give them experience in communicating so they can respond more spontaneously. So the model of language is important. How do you look at language? Desired outcome, what they need to know, what kind of language they need to know, okay? If that language is for communication or for translation or for whatever. And then what model of learning is it based on? Of course, the basis of teaching is learning, right? And as we saw in the history of English language teaching, I mentioned a couple times, I think, in that talk, that, for example, with the grammar translation method, there was no model of learning. And up to that point, there really hadn't been a model of learning. Comenius was an exception. He understood how children learn. They learn through association with nature, for example. But mostly methodology, teachers didn't think so much about how students learned. There was an assumption about how you teach. And students had to learn based on the way you teach. They get it right, they learn. They get it wrong, they haven't. But no one actually looks at what goes on in the learning process. Now, the same thing happened with grammar translation. There was never any assumption about how students learn best. It was more how to teach best. Now, what's great about the time I think we live in now is more and more we're focusing on learning. I mentioned learner autonomy before. That's an important issue because if you want learners to be able to learn on their own without support from the teacher, then you need to think about how learning takes place. And in the classroom, we talk, especially communicative language teaching, we work on interaction, group work, as much as possible, real use of the language, negotiated interaction, things that actually happen in real communication. We're trying to duplicate those in the classroom because that's the model of learning we believe in now, that you need to create as much as possible a situation in the classroom where learners can be spontaneous, where learners can be natural. Now, the classroom is not a natural place, and it never will be a natural place for communication because, again, the triangle, you have the roles as a teacher, the roles as a student. You can pretend to break those rules, and maybe for a moment or two you can actually escape them, but in the end, you're still in a classroom, this is still a structured event, and so it's not a spontaneous event. But as much as possible, we need to think about how learning best takes place in that environment. And if our goal is to create an environment which is not the classroom, but in the classroom, we need to be conscious of two things. One, is that possible? And if we think it's possible, how can we do it without forgetting about the fact that we are in a classroom? Okay, so there are certain things to exploit in the classroom in that role relationship. It's not negative, teacher-student, right? But we need to think about how to replicate good teaching and good learning in an environment which is not natural, to make it as natural as possible, but always be aware that it's not a natural environment. Okay, well that's the end of today's talk, and I'll mention the readings. You have 3 readings this week. You have 2 by Jeremy Harmer and 1 by Paul Knight. Now, the readings I'll be sending to you, and they'll be posted on Libri, but it's a fair amount of reading, so I ask you to get started as soon as possible, and pay close attention to what you're reading, but try to get a sense of approaching teaching, okay? And think about, as you're reading, think about the roles teachers play, students play, and the material plays in each of the methods. And I encourage you to go back and look at this presentation again, particularly to look at the approach to methodology, talking about approaches, methods, procedures, techniques, okay? So think about this, and as I just mentioned, about the outcomes of teaching, the model, because all these things have to go into methods. Also, think about, as you're reading, think about, how is this useful to me? Does this make sense to me? Because always remember that just because somebody wrote a book, created a method, maybe found a group of people that the method worked on, they got some positive results. Somebody published that book, and that book is distributed. Maybe people base textbooks on that method, okay, and try to put that method into practice. It doesn't mean it's right for you. In fact, it doesn't mean it's right for anybody. All right? The point is, you need to analyze things from your point of view. So you need to be an autonomous teacher. As much as we want our students to be autonomous, to be able to learn without too much support from us, okay? Because ultimately we can't watch them 24 hours a day, can't instruct them. We want them to learn. And a lot of learning should take place outside of class, and we're not there, so they need to be able to do it on their own. Now, you as teachers, you need to be able to do it on your own too. So methods are good. They help us, but they can also hurt us because they might constrain us. So in the next several weeks, we'll be looking at methods in particular, different methods, and you'll have more readings about specific methods. But I want you to approach this with an open mind, and I want you to approach this with a mind that's thinking about the context of your teaching, your learning, and what makes sense to you. And if something doesn't make sense, go with your intuition, but try to back it up with some real theoretical ideas. Think about the teacher, think about the learner, and think about the material. Okay, have a good week, and I'll be in touch again next week. Bye now.